Good afternoon, and welcome to How to Do Creative Placemaking, Formalizing Partnerships, Contracts, MOUs, and Agreements. My name is Lynn McCormick, and I am the National Program Director for Local Initiative Support Corporation Creative Placemaking Program. We're happy to be here today to talk about partnerships and putting together contracts and MOUs to support those as you move through your creative placemaking projects. Before we start, I just want to say thank you to the Kresge Foundation for supporting this selection of webinars and the technical assistance program that we've worked on with the National Endowment for the Arts and the Kresge Foundation for over the past year. And then also the LISC Institute that's hosting these webinars with us, and Americans for the Arts who helped develop the curriculum that's part of the instructional pieces of these webinars. And also want to just give a shout out to our friends at PolicyLink. They were really instrumental in the pilot TA program, and we really would not have been able to do this without them. So thank you to PolicyLink. It's my pleasure to also be here today with Catherine Bray-Simons from the National Endowment for the Arts. She's the design specialist for the Our Town program, and she's going to say a few words about why we're here today talking about MOUs, contracts, and partnerships.
Hey, thanks, Lynn. And yeah, on behalf of the National Endowment for the Arts, we want to welcome you all to this, our final webinar in the How to Do Creative Placemaking series. And we've really just been so pleased with the content and the practical advice that has come out of these webinars, and we hope that you have been too. Please share these webinars, these great resources with your colleagues and your partners and in your communities that you're working with. Everything is recorded and downloadable at the same link where you registered at the site that LISC manages. And I'll just say spend a moment reflecting on what this series has been all about. What you've heard from us over this series of 6 webinars will have been a roundup of kind of the best of from a technical assistance pilot initiative that we launched in partnership with LISC and the Kresge Foundation. And for the NEA, it's really been all a part of us thinking through how we can better support this emerging field, in addition to and really beyond providing funding to Our Town projects through the Our Town grant program. So more in this vein is forthcoming. More widely available resources are being developed and will be rolling out over the coming year. And so part of that is that we're developing a workbook that's going to take some of this content covered in these webinars a little bit further. So please stay tuned for that and do stay in touch with us. And in fact, we'll be sharing a survey out as we follow up from this webinar session. So please, as you're able, do fill that out because we really do use this feedback to help us sort of understand how we can be serving the field in these new ways. Quickly, I want to take a moment to express a really heartfelt thanks to the Kresge Foundation and also to our incredible partners at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, Lynn McCormick and Rebecca Cordes-Chan. These two incredible people have really thrown themselves behind gathering and synthesizing this content and delivering it in this rich, accessible, fun way. So thanks to both of you. I'll also just quickly plug the Our Town program. Can't help myself. It's the program I run here at the NEA. So new guidelines for Our Town are on track to be posted at our website, www.arts.gov, in May. The deadline to apply for fiscal year 2020 funds is coming up this summer. That's August 8th, 2019. And we'll be hosting a live webinar to share our advice on how to make a successful application and to answer your questions on June 24th. So please visit www.arts.gov and register for that webinar, and we'll see you there. And now just a quick few words on today's topic. I'll just say that, of course, partnership is really crucial to successful creative placemaking and to Our Town projects. In fact, partnership, as many of you know, is a requirement in the Our Town grant program. So really smoothing out the technicalities and formalizing these relationships is important. And we recognize it can be a new space for a lot of folks embarking on creative placemaking work. So getting off on the right foot can help set the tone for a successful project and also, hopefully, a sustained partnership, right, that lasts well beyond the lifespan of the particular project you're working on, collaborating on right now. And that's what our town is really all about, okay, is seeding a project that gives rise to a lasting change where ultimately arts, culture, and design become just a normal everyday part of what we expect from excellent, equitable community development work in our local communities and across this country. So thanks again from the NEA for being here, and with that, I will pass it back to Lynn.
Thanks, Catherine. So before we get going on sort of the content, I also just want to say a few housekeeping things. For those of you who are just new to joining in on these webinars, there's a question and answer box down in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. If you have any questions as the webinar progresses, feel free to type them in. Please direct them to an individual person. So our guests, Adrienne Southgate and Stephanie Fortunato, will be joining us very shortly. If you have a question that's specific for either one of those folks, just say this question's for Stephanie, and then ask the question. At the end, Rebecca will be sort of facilitating the question and answers after the webinar is over. I'm going to get right to it in terms of the content slides. Stephanie and Adrienne have a lot of material to present, and if contracting and MOU discussions and can be fun and interesting, these two women are going to make it that, so I want to get to that. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of a review for those of you who are on sort of at some of these webinars at the beginning. We did talk about values and partnerships in the first webinar, but I'm just going to go back into sort of what makes why creative placemaking partnerships are important, and then how we can make them stronger. So why creative placemaking partnerships? Well, we all know that partnerships are really important in this work, but we also realize that they can really enable a project team to better understand and be relevant to a community. So the more partnerships, the more different perspectives that are brought in. Oftentimes they bring complementary skills and resources to the table. And I think, especially with the Our Town program, that's really the way these partnerships are sort of incentivized in terms of bringing cultural organizations together with civic organizations to kind of bring skills and resources together to do really amazing work for the community and with the community. Obviously, partnerships allow us to tackle larger tasks. And again, those of us working in this field understand that we're oftentimes very resource scarce. And so the more partners we bring to the table, the more resources and access to different kinds of skill sets come to the table to make the project even stronger. And in doing that, we achieve greater impact in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And as Catherine was saying, we create more sustainable responses to the needs in the community. So if partnerships work well, they're sustained, a lot of different, wonderful things can happen, obviously. So as we look at our partnerships, the first question to ask really is, who is the team? And if we're thinking in the context of an Our Town grant, that's oftentimes the core team would be a city government or a municipal or state government organization and a cultural organization. We may then also be partnering with community development organizations or local arts organizations in our communities. We may be working with community organizers or maybe even an intermediary like LISC. So, but the bottom line is when we look at our team, we're really trying to aim for equitable representation, balance, influence, and resources. So how do we as partners come to the table and create an equitable environment for all of us to work in so that that each organization and each individual is recognized for the value that they bring to the table. Oftentimes, as we know, in partnerships, there are a lot of differences that need to be navigated or at least to be acknowledged and named. We may have different kinds of ways of working from a professional perspective. We definitely have different expertise. We may use different jargon, which is always fun to navigate through. We may have assumptions and be thinking about stereotypes of our partners. We all may have different cultural norms. And if we go back to the very first webinar about setting the table and creating values, that's where this really comes in. Obviously, there are power dynamics that we need to think about in terms of our groups. Oftentimes, there are assumptions, again, being made about maybe a larger organization having more money to bring to the table, or having more power at the table, or the larger organization, maybe you can think you may have more power. So we want to be very careful about, really sorting that through at the beginning of the project and really articulating that. And then what are our shared histories in our communities and with each other? And then obviously there's other things that need to be taken into consideration that you need to think through as you're putting your partnerships together. One of the things that we really need to think about is really matching partnerships and the design of the partnership to the task at hand. So what kinds of partnerships are there? There are many different kinds, but when we think about like a low intensity partnership, we're talking about individual transactions. That could be maybe you're doing a large event and you're going to do small artist contracts for individual projects. We're looking at, in a more intensive way, we're looking at partnerships that have coordinated tasks, that have ongoing collaborations. Stephanie's going to talk a lot about that when she's going through her slides, so I'm going to leave that there. But, how do we break down who's doing what? And then the most intensive, obviously, are institutional collaborations, mergers, those kinds of things that really do need a lot of thinking through prior to starting them, particularly since there's different subsets of rules and regulations within each of those organizations. So how do you navigate those things and understand how they may or may not work together? Even with our NEA partnership, LISC and the NEA have had to look at a lot of how we manage our contracts and what we do, and have had to really dig into some things and sort of, I would say they're very technical aspects of how we're going to move dollars or things like that. So thinking that through ahead is just sets you up for a lot smoother partnership. And then we want to maintain maintaining your partnership. So again, the recognition that we're all together working in the same direction with a shared vision, hopefully, that we're going to be respectful of each other, and that we're going to understand our roles, our relationships with each other. And then in terms of how we're going to, what the reward and the results are going to be as we work together, really being clear about what, for our organization, this would be the reward. For our organization, this would be the results. For the community, these are the results that we're looking for. So to clearly articulate all that up front is just, it's really key, and you need to take time to really work all this through. And in that time, really go back to our original sort of trajectory of creative placemaking. So we're gathering and imagining and then discovering. And so as we go through these steps again, through our partnerships, as we gather and imagine what that partnership looks like, and how we're going to take action and do the results, and then taking the time to really think about what else do we need? Do we need to stop and think about our partnerships? Is anyone missing from this table that really is key to having a strong project at the end, or having a strong action happen during this time? So who's missing? Is everyone here that needs to be, and what other partners may we need to have a successful project as you're going through this iterative process? And again, going back to that value statement, always remembering why you're here. What do you and your partners bring to the project, that expertise, the skills, the networks? Mapping that all out, actually, in a partnership map is also a great idea. What expectations do you have for each other, and what assumptions are you making? What limits need to be respected, and again, what gaps? So I already said that a minute ago, but I feel like this slide's really important to continue to come back to as you're articulating your partnerships and trying to build them. And now, when we talk about getting into written agreements for these partnerships, this is where really the rubber hits the road and the same questions need to be answered. So who are the partners? What are their responsibilities? What are your shared goals? What are your individual goals? The budget? Who's making the decisions on the money? Is someone a fiscal agent? What happens at the end if our project is in the red, or we have a surplus? That's a really key component in terms of building trust and understanding. And then how's the communication handled and where does that sit? And what if we disagree? How are we going to work through those problems? So these are all things that can actually be put into a written agreement and an MOU or an MOU. And so now it is my pleasure to introduce my friends and former colleagues, Stephanie Fortunato, the Director of the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism in the City of Providence, and Adrienne Southgate, the Deputy City Solicitor for the City of Providence. Both of these wonderful women have worked for 3 mayors in their individual tenures in the city government. Stephanie leads the Department of Arts, Culture, and Tourism, which at the intersection of cultural planning and urban development. She collaborates with local communities on creating policies and partnerships to strengthen neighborhoods and transform public spaces. She's led an effort on a cultural plan, a public art plan, has administered and produced several NEAR town grants with multiple partners. And the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism was also a recipient of an Art Place grant that was a very large collaboration. Stephanie has a degree from Providence College and a master's degree from Brown Public Humanities Program. Adrienne, the Deputy City Solicitor, she's smart. She's always the Deputy City Solicitor. Sometimes being number 2 is the way to go. Is one of the most amazing city employees and public servants that I know. She started working for the City of Providence in March of 2003. But before that was at the Executive Council at the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation. She served as the General Counsel at the Public Utilities Commission and was the Chief Legal Counsel at the Department of Environmental Management. She works with the executive branch, but amazingly also works with the City Council and the legislative branch of city government, advising on the City Council Finance Committee, Committee on Ways and Means, and Public Works. Adrienne received her BA from Wellesley College and her law degree from Wayne University, and most importantly, she's a devotee of the arts and can be found at multiple arts events across the City of Providence, and has really been an amazing partner for the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism. And with that, I will turn it over to Stephanie.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Lynn and the NEA, Kresge, everyone who's made this possible. As a bureaucrat, I spend an awful lot of time on the least interesting part of creative placemaking work, which is the contract. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share some of that knowledge with you, and in partnership with my friend Adrienne Southgate here.
And I'm glad to join her.
So I wanted to just give you a sense of the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism and our creative placemaking portfolio. I'll do this pretty briefly because we do have some content, and I know that everyone's eager always for templates and some of the samples that we can provide. But the Department of Art, Culture, and Tourism, we are in city government, and we have a couple of different functions. So we are responsible for programming and promotion, permitting, and some policy work, in addition to the creative placemaking portfolio. Our work is guided by our cultural plan, which is now in its 10th year, and has these 6 interdependent challenges that the community came together to say, this is how we want to address, we want our creative sector to be thinking about as a way to strengthen our community. And many of our creative placemaking projects fall within this goal of building community and fostering neighborhood vitality through increased access and diversified cultural participation. Maybe we would have worded that differently now, but it seems to cover where many of these Our Town projects fall. We have been very fortunate to receive several Our Town grants. Our first one was in 2012, a project that involved a coalition of cultural and civic organizations. And we often joke at the department that we never do anything alone, we do everything in partnership. And so this image here of this youth standing in front of the bus. That bus is wrapped in pictures that have been taken by participants in a youth arts organization, AS220 here. That was a collaboration of the arts organization, city governments, our statewide transit agency, a design agency. So a number of people coming together. And so we really understand the importance, not only of partnership and what it takes to really build trust around partnership, but why it's important to get it right in the contracts. We were lucky to get a second grant, our town grant, and that allowed us to extend the work that we had done to up another area. But we were the victims of our own success here because through our first Our Town grant, we had a festival where we showed everyone the power of arts and culture to transform space and to see our bus depot differently. And so almost immediately thereafter, it decided that there was going to be a major redesign of the bus depot. So the festival we had planned for that area was not possible. So we had to sort of adapt and pivot. And I think one of the things about having really clear guidelines about what the roles and responsibilities are of a partnership is that you can do that as a group. So this is a participatory design process and festivals that have been part of the Our Town process and have led to real change in place. So that bus depot where the festival was now there's an amazing playground there, and there are families regularly using that space and really helping to animate it in different and new ways, which I think is the goal of the Our Town initiative. It's also led to us to be able to think about policy in different ways, and so from some of the pilot work that we've done through our Town projects, we've been able to do things like the public art master planning process that Lynn mentioned. We've worked on really complex creative placemaking projects, and so this was our multi-year art place project in an area of the south side of the city, which was co-led by Rhode Island's LISC office, in which we had invited and engaged several teams of people to come together to make change. Each team, I think, I love that slide that Lynn talked about overcoming difference, but each team had its own set of cultural norms and ways that they worked, ways of being, and in our efforts to keep everyone moving forward, we weren't always paying attention to how those teams were working with one another. So this is a project in which we had many ups and downs because we had the group from an emerging cultural center that were deeply invested in the neighborhood level. We invited students from Rhode Island School of Design to participate in this project. And we had also engaged a group of community champions in this work. And so while everyone was invested in seeing change and addressing the complex social issues, everyone had their own approach to that. And it wasn't always easy. So in the end, it was really when the city and LISC stepped back and allowed the partners to step forward that we were able to realize the promise of this project, and the partners really could take control of that. So I think what Catherine spoke about, the sustained relationships, how important that is. By working through some of the challenging things and going back to the documents and shared principles that we had outlined in the beginning, we were able to get to a point where the partners in that project really own the space and are actively using that in an ongoing way. Through that project, we also thought about artists differently, and so through the work we did with EMC Arts, we began to work with artists as facilitators of community development initiatives, and this has been a really powerful model that we've brought forward to our other creative placemaking work. These are two of our artist facilitators that we're working with on our Kresge Fresh Flow project, a project that's looking at food, economic development, arts and culture, and really thinking about neighborhood-level prosperity in new ways. So this has been a new way for us to work. It's a current project, but I think gets again to the point of why we need to understand, everyone needs to understand their roles and responsibilities to a project. In our current Our Town grant, we're working with a group of resident arts organizations in a neighborhood to activate what will soon be a new bike path and to really embed arts and culture in the plans for that extended bike path. And so again, really respecting that the arts organizations that have been in this neighborhood have been there for a long time, and while there are plans to expand this neighborhood and invite new neighbors, we want to make sure that we're working really closely with the partners that we already have there. So some of the ways in which we've seen this in action, these contracts in action.
So I hope that I'm not going to be too elementary for most of you on this webinar, but on the off chance that there are some of you who are not really familiar with this turf, let me start with what is a contract. It's when two parties have a meeting in the minds about a particular topic and you put it on paper. And I need to figure out how we click. Yep, thank you. And how do you make one? Well, you need three things. An offer, and as you can see on the slide, someone's saying, we want an artist to paint a mural at our local elementary school featuring local points of interest, local foods, and cultural references. Someone says, I'd be happy to paint that mural. That's the acceptance. And consideration, I'll only charge you for time and materials. That is technically all you need for a contract. Really? But why isn't that enough? There are some little gaps in the contract that we've just outlined. For example, it comes August and the mayor wonders why those murals haven't been painted yet. And your contract didn't deal with that issue. And your painter says, too hot to paint in the summer. We were talking about food. We thought farm to table when we said food. Your artist thought it was the local Applebee's. They charged you $6,000 for the paint. Well, they said for materials, and they've got the receipts to prove that they spent that much. So now you're in a quandary. And of course, my favorite, which has unfortunately come to pass a few times in the past, when were you planning to tell us that you were a registered sex offender? In case you don't know, registered sex offenders are not permitted within a certain number of feet of an elementary school. So this would have been a deal breaker. So it's hard to think about everything. And that's why, first of all, contracts often have lots of clauses. But secondly, we in the city find it easier to deal with things if we have prepared contract templates, which can be, sort of special purposed to meet circumstances, whether they are relatively simple or fairly complex. The PVD, or Providence Festival, which is our huge arts festival given annually in June, involves fiscal agency, cultural curation, and all sorts of details, including relationships with about 12 different city departments and so forth. And there are spin-off contracts for artists and performers and vendors. And I mean to tell you, even though I like Stephanie very much, she just brought me a stack of about 150 performer contracts, all of which had to be signed by me in quadruplicate. And I'm thinking that the Girl Scout cookies she promised if we finish this webinar are not going to be enough of a reward. But the point is, you can do the same thing. If you are doing a fair amount of contracting, it probably makes sense for you to go ahead and set up a template contract or two that can be used in many circumstances. What will often happen is that you will have a vendor who will give you their standard contract. And the reason I suggest that you sort of look at those dubiously is that they often contain boilerplate clauses, and they do not favor the sponsoring agency's interest. Those include things like the ones I've outlined on the slide: venue, which is where the suit can be brought, choice of law, whose law is going to apply if something goes completely wacky, and indemnification, which sometimes is written, and I hope you all know what indemnification is, but it's a promise essentially to serve as an insurer in case something happens. And so if your vendor says, if anything happens, you city or you county or you small nonprofit organization are bound to indemnify us for damages, you need to know that, and it would be best if you can avoid it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some basic contracts. In many places, in order to do contracting, you have to get involved with the purchasing process, which means that you are issuing a request for proposals and then receiving bids. In many places also, just that, the RFP and the responsive bid are sufficient to form a contract. But when that happens, I just remind you of that list of amusing examples we had. It doesn't include all of the things that you're going to want to include in a contract. It may include things like the term and how much is going to be paid, but it might not include things like insurance, indemnification, how are you planning on terminating the contract if there's a problem, and so forth. Even for these very simple contracts, that may be the case. So we think of them as being sort of a transactional, one-time event things. And you'll see that we've got sort of a template here, a very, very simple template. And I will just let Stephanie kind of talk you through how it's being used by Art, Culture, and Tourism and she'll cover that on the next few slides.
Absolutely. So these contracts are the least intensive in terms of the trajectory that Lynn offered earlier, and really are meant to just explain the who, what, where, when, why, and how. That's kind of what we cover in these contracts. So you can see at the top there, you're asking for the name, we're specifying the when it's going to place, where it's going to place, and it really establishes upfront the amounts that the artist can expect for this engagement. Because we all know that artists must be paid, so we want to put that up front. Really important when we provide these contracts to artists, and artists, if you're on this phone call, I want you to hear this. It's really important. This is a formal, an official contract, and so we ask for it to be returned alongside of W-9, which is the IRS tax form there. But it's really important that these documents match. So if you have an artist name, and that is not your legal given name, if you do not tell us your legal given name, we cannot send you a check that you will be able to cash. Likewise, if you provide us with an address that is no longer your address, it is very unlikely that you will receive that check. So it's really important to go back and forth here, and this is really tedious stuff, but it does really matter. Really important to think about project specifics and the things that you might need for this particular transaction. So if there is going to be an event that is happening in a place where you'll need to be in touch with someone during the day, really important to get the contact for the day of the show. So just particulars of the project are important to embed in these contracts here. And so also, this is a place to outline what you will be providing, the person who is engaging this, so people can understand up front what they can expect from this engagement. And so you can see we have at the top the terms of payment. This is really important to establish, although in city government it's very hard to guarantee the when and the how sometimes, but important to note that as well. Let people know what is expected of them, and these performance terms, they might be expanded into a different code of conduct if that's appropriate to your partnership's culture. Important to lay out the technical terms and provisions if it's a performance. So to let people know what they can expect is just a baseline package. There will not be a full-on Aerosmith concert produced at the day of the event or whatever it is. Merchandising provisions, to really outline who is going to get the money for that merchandise, to embed all these clauses in these simple contracts up front. We also try and include related agreements, so that way just to streamline the paperwork. And so one that is pretty standard for us at this point is to include a photo release, because we want to make sure that anyone who's performing, that we are able to use these images going forward when you are doing a webinar for the NEA. So this is kind of just some standard language. And please feel free, Adrian and I really work hard on the language, and so if this would work for any contracts that you're working on, please feel free to use it as samples. So some important reminders from my lawyer.
Okay, well, just, outline the project details, and whichever event you're using it for, make sure that you have covered the waterfront as we suggested. Being transparent about the responsibilities and rights of the artist and the sponsor. It really is, we often get ourselves into trouble where we have not clarified who's doing what to whom and when. And, of course, the documentation to support payment. I've got lawyers in my office who don't get paid because they haven't filed things in the proper format. I'm sure all of you guys have struggled with payments as well, so that's pretty critical. And combining as many of the smaller agreements that you're going to ultimately need into one agreement, because you've got sort of one real easy time to get them to sign when they want the work and you want them to do it. Now, kind of the next level of contracting would be the grant-funded community partnerships. And again, this is where Stephanie and her department really shine.
So yeah, example of this is an NEA Artworks grant, and that is actually an image of Holly Ewald's floating film screen that she created with support from the NEA a few years ago. But this is a situation in which you've jointly decided to apply for an award, and now you really need to clarify how this is going to happen in real life. It's the more intensive category on that trajectory. So what we do up front is we use whereas statements to help define the partnership. And I think these whereas statements are really important to put up front because it's an opportunity to really summarize not only your shared principles and values for the project, but really to also embed some more of the transformational aspirations that you have for projects up front. So in this grant, this sample that we're showing you, the ACT, or the Department of Agriculture and Tourism, is responsible to the funder, and we are engaging partners to help make this project happen. And so you can see towards the bottom, we mentioned 2 different partners right in this agreement here, also showing that this is a partnership of multiple parties. So after the whereas, we get into the parties' promises and obligations, and this is fairly straightforward, really outlining, what the city is responsible for and what the other partners are responsible for. One thing I do want to note here is we make our vendors obtain a liability insurance policy. So to getting to that indemnification that Adrienne mentioned before, this is something that is really central to put up front because it will help govern how this partnership will work if things don't go as expected.
And in this situation, the steel yard, which is going to be the fabricator, has got capacity to be able to provide an insurance policy. One of the things that we've run into fairly frequently, and that you may run into in your own life in your artistic communities, is that artists are not generally very familiar with insurance, and they have a hard time negotiating for themselves. And often the notion of purchasing $1 million of insurance cover is just a little too much. We have talked in other circumstances about having our fiscal agent procure insurance policy when there's a fiscal agent involved. But because the city is self-insured for all risks, we're not in a situation where we can step up, other than asking the taxpayers to front whatever the ultimate costs are. So this whole insurance thing can get to be a really thorny issue when you're doing contracting with communities that may not have familiarity with this particular provision.
I want to talk quickly about intellectual property, and I also want to note that this probably deserves its own webinar, but we always include a term around intellectual property in our agreements with community partners. I think it's really important. We all work really hard on these projects, and we do want to be able to share them with our professional communities and with our boards and patrons, and so I think it's important to acknowledge and talk about that up front, what is allowed and what is acceptable among your partnership. But again, that's just a quick note that should be picked up at a different point.
And I just note on that in many cases, granting authorities may believe that all intellectual property should belong to them. So take a quick look at that when you are receiving grants to be sure that you know what the scope of ownership is. All right, so some of the components of this more complicated agreement where you have multiple partners would be the RFP and the bid and the basic contract. We're still including many of the same terms that we talked about before, but we're going to be sure that we include information on termination and insurance and indemnification. And Stephanie can show you a form of that contract.
So in order to create these partnerships, we have developed a template that I wanted to share with you because I think it's really helpful. Even if you have jointly written the grant with a partner, notification can take 9-10 months sometimes, and conditions may have changed. And so we have created this as a way for us to sort of regroup, to restate what we wanted to do together, and to make sure that everyone feels comfortable with any changes that might not be made. You didn't get all that you asked for, and you need to revise the budget. And so this is a form that allows you to kind of outline these details and in sort of objective terms, really look at what is possible here. So here's an example of a form. So we pre-populate the first page of this form with the main terms from the grant proposal that we have all spent hours of our lives getting right and making sure that every single word is correct. This is a way for us to use that and sort of pay it forward by capturing it here on the front page that we provide to our community partners. It's only a very select group of people that are receiving this form, and you may adapt this in so many ways to the particulars of your partnership. So the second part of this is information that we need from our community partner in order to be able to write that contract. So it gives us an opportunity to collect up front the federal tax ID, the mission statement, the sort of operational logistics there, and to really get into what the community partner's goals are. I see a typo. Oh, that's terrible. Anyway, but to really allow the community partner to identify their goals and objectives for themselves. So we are not putting words into the mouth of our community partners. It really allows us to establish some trust and a baseline for conversation. We also want to be really transparent around the budget of what are the resources that are available, where are they coming from, and who will be getting what. Often when you're putting together a community partnership, people will be getting different amounts of money depending on their roles in this project, but I think it's really important in terms of building trust, if it works for you, at least among the leadership, to really be clear about who in the partnership is being rewarded either financially or with staffing. We also talk about in-kind support. So we want people to know that and to begin to consider how the amount of time and energy that they're putting into a project, that they can count that as part of this partnership. It's such a critical part of all of these creative placemaking initiatives. And so what we do is we take the mechanics of that grant application, this kind of special grant application that we've created, and we then go straight forward and create one of our agreements from that. So we turn all of those shared principles into whereas statements. We take the specifics about the roles and responsibilities and the particulars of money, and we put it into an agreement so we can make beautiful things like festivals. We're engaging lots of neighbors and bringing people together. This is from our Illuminating Trinity project again. So that's some more intensive projects, but now we want to talk briefly about the most intensive projects, which are really these public-private partnerships.
And that's our city hall, in case you don't know. We have a wonderful city hall. I love this term that Stephanie uses, co-production, for these complex contracts. Now we've got the RFP, we've got the bid, we've got what's the basic contract, and then what I've called miscellaneous annoying lawyer stuff. We've got multi-parties, we may have very complicated reimbursement schemes or fiscal agency agreements. There may be benchmarking or penalty provisions. We don't pay you unless you hit an attendance of X, or if you have not done Y, there's going to be a penalty imposed. And then really setting up contingency plans. And this is obviously challenging because you've got a bunch of parties who are not normally working on a very complex arrangement, and now they must figure out how to do so. Some of them will have the constraints of government operations. Some of them will be responding directly to funders. Some of them are trying to raise their money just so that they can keep their doors open, and that makes it really challenging. So we wanted to share with you something that we're going to call a Sloppy Joe. It's an example of one of the PVD Fest contracts. This is our opportunity to create a Jackson Pollock in the form of a contract. What you're going to have is, as the multiple parties go through the contract and everybody is inserting or deleting things, that's what you're going to get, is something that looks very much like this. That means that it's really critical to spend time on the principles, going back to what Stephanie was saying earlier, in that lovely template where she was collecting all the information. If those principles are not very clearly understood by all of the parties, you're setting yourself up for failure. It also makes it possible for us to sort of set some parameters, and you'll see that on the next couple of slides. You know, what's the duration of the contract, what's the operational framework, who's acting as a fiscal agent, how is the budget going to be settled upon, And what happens in the event that we fall short in our fundraising? And I'm not asking you to look at this slide for content, just to show you that for this particular Sloppy Joe project, we had a series of 4 budget scenarios depending on how dramatically we either exceeded or fell short of our fundraising goals. So agreeing on the budget can be a really challenging piece of this whole puzzle. So, shared responsibilities. This is the place where working on that question that Lynn identified early on of, how do we handle both overages and shortfalls, and what is going to happen, and who do donors belong to? If I'm accessing the donor list from one of my funders and they make a big gift, who gets to count that? I mean, there are all sorts of concerns about that. Also, expenses may be incurred in the course of doing this, and if you have not spelled them all out, the question is, who's supposed to be approving those kinds of expenses? Lots of things like that. Questions about who's going to publicize the event and what the scope of the publication should be. So those are all some of the things that we have mentioned here, and again, mostly from bitter experience, we've included things like it's important for the entity to participate in regular meetings with our city staff, and we've got actually quite a big team that meets to discuss what's going on in the city on a biweekly basis, and that gives us a chance to sort of get into the nitty-gritty of these things. Maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, I want to say this public-private partnership, actually, that we're talking about right here, this was born in an Our Town grant, and if you are the lead civic or cultural partner on a Our Town grant, this is a sample that you'll want to pay attention to. But we sometimes use this as an opportunity to really embed deliverables into that. So if you want people to report out to you monthly, so that way you understand what's going on, it's an important place where you can put this in there. So you'll see that in number 8 at the bottom there. But again, just an example of how working together with another partner, you want to be as clear as possible about who's doing what, why, and how. And the distribution of funding, again, this is a really important part of any contract. So being really clear about how the budget will flow and when people can expect that, especially when you, again, as lead partners, are going to be responsible for subcontractors and other vendors and other artists as well.
So I've said it's important to note you will need a lawyer. I really do recommend that you have somebody helping you out here, because these can be pretty complicated documents. Turning to some other, what we call instruments, and in legal terms that doesn't mean something that you play or use to make noise. The first 2 are used broadly, Memoranda of Understanding and Memoranda of Agreement, but there seems to be a misunderstanding about what they are. They are not contracts. What they are agreements by individuals who say we are going to work together towards a common goal. They don't include sanctions. If you screw up on a Memorandum of Understanding, you've broken the trust and there may not be an ongoing relationship. If you've broken a Memorandum of Agreement, there may not be a future agreement. But fundamentally, they are not things that have consequences attached to them in the monetary world. The other 5 things on here are all contracts, and they all do have financial consequences. And so what internally we say, legal wants to review all of these things, but it's absolutely critical that we review anything that looks like a contract. And so we're going to sign off on an indemnification agreement, a services agreement, a promissory note, a release of liability, and so forth. I don't really always sign off on Memoranda of Understanding and Agreement, and particularly if something is grant funded, I may not sign off. That's my dog, incidentally. He comes to the law department every day, and he was there because I gave this presentation in another context, and I was telling people not to pretend that their contract was under $5,000, which was the limit of authority for departments. So they were pretending that it was $4,999. Hudson says no. Okay, so some other possible things that you might want to utilize.
Yes, so one thing that I have learned over my 10 years of working in city government and on these big creative placemaking initiatives is that site control really can determine the success or failure of your project, and so it's really important to get it in writing. And so this is a pretty standard form, which just really clarifies the responsibility of a property owner. If you had a public art piece that you were installing on the facade of that building, you might also want to get an artist to sign off on that agreement. If you are using a vacant or abandoned lot to hold a festival, for instance, there may be other concerns of the property owner around insurance and understanding. If you are doing a temporary project, okay, that's fine, but if you want to take that temporary project in a cemetery and you want to make it permanent, there may be a whole other host of conversations about site control and use. If you are working on an Art Town grant in which the state owns the building where you are hoping to activate and they are not allowing people inside because of health safety issues and you have to move your event outside, you may need a whole other set of agreements. So I just really caution everyone to think about site control and site use and to get it in writing if you can up front.
Absolutely. So we're going to talk very briefly about termination because we did want to leave a little bit of time for question and answer here. This is our standard termination clause, and, no harm, no foul. If the artist dies, okay. If the artist doesn't perform satisfactorily, we try and give written notice, and if the artist can attempt a cure, and with 30 days prior written notice, either party the artist can opt out as well. But, we've got to have a plan. What happens if on the day of the event, all at once, the artist doesn't show? That is really one of the reasons why you get that day of phone number. When it appears in an institutional relationship, it's a little more formal. You'll see that we've given you 4 paragraphs instead of a little quick thing. But seriously, termination is something that's worth spending more than 30 seconds on, and I'm sorry that I don't have more time to talk about it now.
Yes. This is a slide, one of those institutional relationships that left a public art orphan, and so in thinking about, whether or not it was right to end that relationship, we did go back to our shared principles from the beginning and really got through those whereas statements. It really helped us not only mend the relationship, but also come to an agreement, okay, this wasn't going to work in this project, but we will look to the intent of the future to hopefully put that outcomes that we want to see out there.
So the last thing to talk about is closing the deal. You need to decide how your contract is going to be signed. Are you going to require in-person signatures? Are you going to use DocuSign, which is, for those who don't know, it's an electronic signing service? How many counterparts are you going to have? Is it okay to fax your signature? And all those kinds of things need to be discussed with the other people on the deal. I have a particular note here about appendices. The city has a long history of doing things like entering into agreements that say, refer to Appendix A for payment terms, and Appendix A is nowhere to be found and nobody knows where it is. So I suggest that you number everything, 1 of 20, 2 of 20, and so forth, so that you can make sure that you've got a complete set of everything that is part of your contract. And that, I believe, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our slides.
It sure does. Yes, so we know this can be tedious. We know this takes a lot of time. It's a lot of back and forth, and it can be challenging at times to agree upon those whereas statements and make sure that you get it right. But what we want in the end are happy partners who are working together for a greater good. I think that's the promise of not only creative placemaking, certainly these Art Town projects where we're really thinking about what is the role of art, culture, and design in communities and how can it really catalyze change.
And we want you to know that we are here and are available to chat with you or to email with you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us because that's what we're here for.
That's right. And I think we did it, so we will hand this back. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Adrian. I think that was a great way to just add life, but also levity to what can be a somewhat dry topic at times. And you really did a great job of bringing us full series on the circle from where we started several months ago. Talking about building and nurturing partnerships
all the way to formalizing them to really get a project done. Hold on one second as the slides update. There we go. So we have a few minutes for questions. If our audience could type them into the Q&A box, Amani and I will be monitoring that. So far, looking. Any questions? Just a note, we will be posting the presentation to the LISC How to Do Creative Placemaking website, the same website where you registered, along with all the other recordings and presentations to date. Anyone? Looking. Questions?
I have a question for you. Oh, is that? How long should they make the contract? Oh, am I, for example, in the front? Okay. Oh, no, wait, what's this, for example?
Okay, the question's for me. How long should I make the contract terms? I think I'm going to have to ask my questioner what the context is. What I normally do is say I will not enter a contract for longer than a year, but if it is a situation in which I have a new creative partner, I might make it a pilot for a shorter period of time, and that would be very much dependent on what's going on. In the city of Providence, we can do outdoor art installations and presentations from, say, sometime in April through maybe early November, but I probably am not going to partner with somebody to do an outdoor installation unless they're doing it at the skating rink. So it kind of depends on what the circumstances are. If the questioner would like to flesh that out, we're going to have another opportunity, I believe, to answer some questions going forward.
Thank you. Anyone else? We have time for like one more.
Are we supposed to click on them? I don't know.
So we do have one, and this will just squeeze us in real fast. Is there a contracting best practice out there when working as a consultant in the creative placemaking process? Can you speak to that? I know both of you are representing kind of the city perspective, but if you have thoughts on that.
Well, your question really is there a best practice? And I don't know that I've got enough breadth of experience to be able to answer whether there's a best practice. I can tell you that we do consultant contracts all the time, not in the creative placemaking context, but otherwise. And I would say that the same kinds of considerations that we've been outlining would obtain there as well. But perhaps Stephanie has got more experience than I do on this score.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that a lot of times arts organizations might be considered a consultant on these projects, and so that more intensive, that mid-range of agreements might be something that I would look to as an example, just really outlining again what people are receiving from a grant and what the roles and responsibilities are particular to that vendor, that consultant's job as part of the initiative.
Great, thank you. And one more, this is a big question, but hopefully we can truncate it. The question is, I'd be interested in hearing how VERA Act of 1990 is addressed in your work. Do you ask artists to waive their rights? I feel like this is like this could easily be a webinar on its own, but I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes again to the intellectual property conversation there. I mean, we do our best to incorporate VERA into our agreements, but this is actually an active conversation that we're having around the public art projects that we're implementing right now. It's an area where I am not an expert, so I really can't speak to it and wouldn't want to, so might be one to consult a lawyer on or someone in your community that knows more.
Okay. All right, and with that, we are at time. I really hope that the How to Do Creative Placemaking series has been a useful resource for planning and implementing creative placemaking projects in our audience's communities. Just a reminder, please take the survey, the exit survey that will pop up on your screen as you exit from this webinar. And that also, once again, all of the recordings and the webinar slides will be posted on the LISC How to Do Creative Placemaking website, along with other research and reports on arts, culture, and community development that we've made available. Thank you so much, Stephanie and Adrian. Thank you so much to our audience for signing on. And with that, that's a wrap. Thanks, everyone.